Okay, Cornell.
All right, we shall jump right in. On the one hand, continue the conversation we had last week about race and class, and then Professor Unger will give a more formal presentation having to do with the alternative visions and alternative strategies as it relates to various forms of inequality, racial, class-wise, gender-based, or what have you. As you might recall that Professor Unger trotted out 4 different rubrics, 4 different categories or traditions having to do with serious reflection about race and its relation to class, and we always add empire and gender, sexual orientation, and so on, even ethnicity as well. He talked about the collaborationists with Booker T. Washington. He talked about the successionists with Marcus Garvey. He talked about the orthodox integrationists with mainstream liberal and neoliberal black leaders. And then at the end, he talked about the reconstructionists. And we can come back and fill out much more of the content and substance of those 4. But I think it's very important anytime you talk about race and class to never downplay the fundamental role of violence and brute force and coercion when it comes to any American citizen struggling against white supremacy. Now, this is in no way to downplay the other vicious forms of xenophobia that have been circulating. Anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, and so forth and so on. But historically, and of course in this class we go back over and over again to the interplay, the historical, the genealogical, the present, analysis of the present, informed by the past, and then always rejecting the neoliberal cliche that there is no alternative. We in this class are fundamentally committed to an alternative at the visionary level, the programmatic level, on the ground in terms of social action and social movement, no matter how bleak it seems. And I know this past week with President Trump talking about this military parade on July 4th. What is it? He went to Paris and got fired up. He saw all the military display and so forth and said, oh my God, we should do that here in America. So maybe on the 4th we're going to see all the different military branches in uniform. We haven't had that since 1991 in the history of this empire when we had the 9/11 with the vicious attack on innocent people in New York City. So the whole issue of militarism and the various forms of militarization take you directly into serious talk about race. And you can be assured that anybody who talks about race that doesn't accent the crucial role of violence and coercion and brute force are deodorizing the discourse. They're sanitizing, they're sterilizing the discourse. Why? Because they know to talk about violence and force and coercion tends to be counter to a more mainstream or streamlined discussion about race relations. Every time I see that phrase, it makes me want to vomit. Race relation, like just black and white and black and red. We've just been relating to each other. Please. Enslavement, Jim Crow, lynching, subordination, domination. That's not just race relations. You see, you're talking about asymmetric relations of power and so forth and so on. So when we talk about militarization, it means then we have to acknowledge the ways in which militarization and commodification have gone hand in hand. Now, in the great tradition of W.B. Du Bois, or Cedric Robinson's powerful text of 1983, Black Marxism, or Harvard's own Brother Walter Johnson. Has anybody taken courses from Walter Johnson in this class yet? Oh, you got to take his courses. He's a serious historian. Robin Kelly would be another, but he's at UCLA, so you're going to need an airplane. You're going to need a ticket to study with him, but you can study from Johnson. or Brother Vincent here at Harvard, others who talk about racial capitalism. And what they're talking about is the degree to which, given the initial encounter with indigenous peoples, dispossession of lands, violation of peoples, the slave-holding capitalist regime between 1787 to 1860s, the slave-holding capitalism, predominantly in the South, but it begins in the whole country. In the whole country. So we don't like to use that language of racialized capitalism or slave-holding capitalism, but from the analysis of what we're trying to do in this class, which is to say be unflinchingly honest and candid about the historic roots and origins and beginnings of these various structures of domination. We know patriarchy was always already in place. It was reappropriated in a certain way. Homophobia the same way. The anti-Jewish hatred, the anti-Muslim hatred, all of that carried with any civilization disproportionately shaped by Christianity. In the United States, those factors were then compounded with the encounter of indigenous peoples and then the fundamental economic foundation of American democracy. We must never forget, in 1860, the value of 4 million slaves was far greater than the value of all the land, tools, canals, and technology. That's hard to believe. But that's how crucial, and that's why our own great Orlando Patterson here, I hope you all take Orlando Patterson's courses. He's one of the giants of the academy. When he talks about the difference between a slave holding a slavocratic democracy versus a democracy that happens to have slavery. America was a former. That's how deep it cut. And that's why it took violence to break the back of America's version of apartheid. 750,000 precious human beings on both sides killed. And how difficult it was in the 1960s, because once you break the back of slave-holding capitalism, here comes Jim Crow capitalism. And it takes another 80 years to break the back of Jim Crow capitalism. And then after Jim Crow capitalism, what? The new Jim Crow capitalism. Mass incarceration, mass unemployment, mass underemployment, mass low-quality education. That is now the reality in this democratic experiment when it comes to those peoples of color, especially black peoples, who are disproportionately represented in the poverty, categories of poverty, categories of low-quality education, and so forth and so on. So it cuts that deep, and therefore it's very, very difficult to have a conversation without becoming profoundly pessimistic. And I think it's no accident that when you actually look at those 4 traditions that we talked about, and the fact that the one tradition that generated the largest mass movement of Garvey, profoundly pessimistic about the capacity and ability of the vast majority of our fellow citizens to ever treat people of color with dignity and with decency. Garvey used to say on every speech that the vast majority of black people in America will live lives of ruin and disaster because the vast majority of white fellow citizens don't have the interest, will not give the priority to treat black people with decency or dignity. And of course, we're experiencing some very ugly white racist backlash now under President Trump. But the important thing is not to somehow view that as some isolated phenomena. It has deep, deep historic roots, and it forever is bubbling, and sometimes it bubbles over more so than others. But the very fact that we live in such a moment behooves us to be very, very clear about what the larger historical backdrop actually looks like. Now, in addition to militarization, in addition to commodification, there is what we could call niggerization. And what is niggerization? It is a profoundly U.S. phenomenon, not because black people have not been hated in other parts of the world, or not because certain Africans don't hate other Africans on the continent of Africa. But niggerization is distinctly USA because niggerization actually escalates and intensifies with the emergence of that second stage of Jim Crow capitalism. What distinguishes the United States from Brazil, for example, or Jamaica, or Cuba, where they had slavery across the board. But they never had the transformation of slaves into citizens overnight. And then the emergence of a terroristic regime of Jim Crow, of lynching every 2.5 days for over 50 years, of massive segregation, massive discrimination, but especially the terroristic face of lynching. So that you can talk about what Brazil was, 1888, I think, was the abolition of slavery and so forth. Still got racial discrimination, still got attempts to devalue and dishonor black people. No institutionalized form of terrorism in Brazil vis-a-vis black people with a one-drop rule. So niggerization is a building on the hatred, devaluing, and dishonoring of black people under slaveholding capitalism. But then for 12 years, as Du Bois puts it, the sun shined for 12 years. America tried to do something historically unprecedented in the history of the modern world, which is what? To produce a multiracial democracy. You had 2 black senators from Mississippi. You had the head of the chief of the Supreme Court in South Carolina, black, all 3 of them. Very, very difficult, very, very unprecedented. And then, boom, withdrawal of the military troops. Boom, the massive institutionalization of terrorism, generating various kinds of trauma. As the United States elites turn their backs on those 4 million who had been enslaved, leaving them unprotected, unsafe, subject to random violence, and hated for who they are. So the creation of an intensified process of niggerization, the transformation from slave to citizen to now second, third class citizen, with massive campaigns of hatred against these people. So you get psychic violence. You get spiritual violence. We're going to see de Tocqueville talks about this in the 1830s. When he talks about this form of spiritual violence and spiritual despotism among targeting these black people. He said, I've never seen anything like it. He says it's unprecedented. France, we have our colonies, we have our colonized subjects, but something is distinctive here. And this is not to say that Americans have some different human nature or anything. Like any other set of human beings anywhere around the world. But historically and culturally, these particular people were perceived as the source of a fundamental threat. If they can lead us to the most barbaric civil war in modern times, we ought to be highly mindful of their threat. And you remember what Thomas Jefferson said about the race problem. And I think I've made the point in this class, there's never been a race problem, just catastrophes visited on people of color. Jefferson said, this race problem is like trying to guide a wolf by the ears. It's going to jump at us. It's going to come back at us. Or as Malcolm X used to say, the chickens come home to roost. And that's one of the unbelievable fears that's mainstreamed when it comes to black people in America. You see. And that's one of the reasons why you have such massive uses of violence against so many folk in the black freedom movement. Massive assassinations, character assassination, literal assassination, the psychic messages, especially in the professional and managerial classes. If you come out of this class and are fundamentally committed to this movement, you better be ready to die. Oh my God, I thought I went to Harvard in order to live a healthy life. I thought I went to Harvard to live a wealthy life. Why do I want to give that up? I've got to get my spirit intact. I think I have high character, but do I have to make that kind of sacrifice? Open question. Fundamental question. And that's true not just for those coming out of professional managerial sites. This is true for the working classes. It's true for poor people, women, gays, all the folk. And this is true for white brothers and sisters. Because there's a long, rich tradition. Not as thick as it ought to be, but there's a rich tradition of white fellow citizens struggling against white supremacy, many of them paying the ultimate price. Got the three brothers down in Mississippi in the 60s, John Brown in the 19th century, Ann Braden, we can go on and on and on. But these issues of life and death, when it comes to talk about race, it's just not a professional chit-chat. It's an existential dialogue in which everything is at stake. And niggerization is precisely the attempt to do what? To make sure you institutionalize the vicious attacks on black intelligence, black beauty, black moral character, and try to ensure that black people remain intimidated and fearful and scared, and therefore more willing to be deferential to the powers that be. And this is a process that cuts across the board. We could talk about it in terms of the new Jim Crow, financialized capitalism in the last 30 years or so, where in fact it has been the black professional class that has been niggerized. Just give them enough status, give them enough wealth, give them enough presence in mainstream, and they're scared to tell the truth about how their cousins are being incarcerated in an intense way. They won't accent the degree to which the kids in the hood are going to decrepit schools or living with inadequate housing. That won't be their priorities. They will be obsessed with the celebrities circulating at the top and celebrating that success while this misery is increasing. Just keep the black professionals intimidated, scared, and fearful, and won't tell the truth because they're more committed to their careers than they are any deep sense of calling. And that's what's been massive in the last 35 or 40 years, you see. And so when we talk about social motion, social momentum, social movements on the ground, when we talk about what Brother Roberto is going to talk about with the level of ideas, the alternatives, or the debates about affirmative action, we were talking about that before, you see. And whether in fact class ought to be one of the variables vis-a-vis race. Or is it fair that, my daughter ought to somehow be put ahead of a brilliant black person in Dorchester? Because I'm a petty bourgeois Harvard professor. By petty bourgeois, I mean I'm not part of the bourgeoisie. I don't have that kind of money. I'm not going to have the cash some of you are going to have, and I wish you well. I pray for you. But I'm not broke as the Ten Commandments financially either. I'm not poor. I'm not working class. I'm part of the professional managerial class. But beneath the bourgeoisie in terms of big access to big capital, you see. And so the issue of affirmative action is one that feeds into how will those who have been victimized by white supremacy for so long, those who have also been victimized by class privilege for so long, and then, of course, the crucial issue of gender. We can go on and on and on about this, you see. So let me stop now, because we want to have a very brief dialogue, and then we're going to move into a longer presentation, and we'll come back with another dialogue. Is that all right, Roberto?
Yes.
Absolutely. So any quick questions or comments before we move on to the larger presentation? Don't hesitate. Yes, my dear sister.
Louder.
Yeah.
Other countries that have maybe similar but not exactly identical situations, like
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. I think, one, you always want to try to avoid using one's own country as the only lens through which you look at other countries. I mean, one of the roles of education, of deep paideia, is to jump outside of one's own skin and try to look at the world through the lens of other people's realities. So that Mexico has a very rich, complicated history in relation to indigenous peoples and African peoples, or even before the early indigenous peoples, given those representations they have going back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and then the Spanish conquest, and then the interaction with a variety of other peoples. So when we look at any country, you want to be clear that they have as rich and as complex a history as USA, and therefore we can make certain comparative claims. But it's never going to be a matter of, oh, that's the version of white folk in America. No, no, no. There's no other version of white folk in America other than white folk in America. South Africa looks just, no. South Africa has its rich history. Ugly Danish imperialism struggles against it, role of the English, We have to be very open-minded in terms of being clear that we try to understand each country in light of their own realities and struggles and sufferings. But we know, human beings being human beings, we will have our prejudices and prejudgments. Therefore, our own partiality as Americans will play some role. We just want to be mindful of it. We just want to be mindful. Now, at the moral and spiritual level, I would say that we ought to be thoroughly consistent in terms of our sensitivity to people who are suffering in whatever country, whatever civilization, whatever empire. Because at that level, on the moral level, there are human beings who warrant our care and concern and so forth and so on. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Last week we spoke about the civic decay, the increased alienation in America.
Yes.
Is that in reference to an earlier time in which there was more engagement, more openness, more active engagement civically?
Well, we certainly had higher levels of civic participation in the 19th century, but of course the vast majority of American peoples couldn't vote, especially, namely women. Black men could vote. The last 35 years, black women couldn't vote at all. But you certainly had higher levels of civic participation. We'd have to tell a story about the fundamental role of big money, the fundamental role of the breakdown of city machines on the local level, the fundamental role of political parties themselves undergoing the shaping of big sponsors and benefactors that distance themselves more and more from people on the ground. And therefore, people more and more become convinced that politics doesn't matter in terms of them having a voice that makes a difference in civic participation. And that's a very, as you can imagine, that's a class in and of itself. But civic apathy, breakdown of civic friendships, breakdown of civic virtue, that has escalated and intensified in the last 25 or 30 years with the cynicism, the spectatorial cynicism of more and more citizens, sense of helplessness and hopelessness and so on.
Cornell, I just want to point out what to me is a strange feature of our conversation about race and class. Last week, we questioned the integrationist orthodoxy.
The third
of those four approaches to race and class. The integrationist orthodoxy is a central part of the beliefs of contemporary American progressives. Therefore, the question of whether it should be retained or replaced is a momentous question for the progressives and for American democracy. The strange feature of the conversation is that no one has come to the defense of the integrationist orthodoxy. Is that because you believe that it should be rejected and replaced, or I simply want to understand the course of the discussion. We can't pass lightly over this significant incident in our inquiry.
And that's a question for...
For you, not for me.
Yeah, for the class. It's,
So I've been listening to your point that things like racial affirmative action at the university level and things like corporate feminism don't address the class inequality. So to your point, I was wondering whether you think that having gender parity, in politics or in corporate executive levels, or having racial representation in universities and other things should be a goal. Do you think that there is a purpose to that?
Well, we focus specifically on race and class. And in my discussion of the four approaches and of the integrationist orthodoxy, I accuse the integrationist orthodoxy of three faults you'll remember. The main fault is that it generates benefits in inverse proportion to the need, benefiting most those who need less, that it separates the black elite from the mass of poor blacks, and the third is that it offends the white working class majority of the country and makes more difficult the formation of a transracial progressive majority. And then I went on to defend an alternative direction, distinguishing individualized racial discrimination, which under this alternative would be criminalized, from the promotion of groups that are entrapped in situations from which they cannot escape. And you can imagine how such a proposal would be developed in institutional and legal detail. This is not a minor issue, which of these directions the country is to follow. A great deal turns on this. We don't have to discuss it right now, but I simply want to signal that this is a question of great significance, that much turns on this.
Jump right in.
Yes.
I think I remember discussing this a little bit last class, and kind of developing more of that thought based on the day. I find that the concern about offending the white working class, to me, is a question of rhetoric rather than policy. The fact that
A question of
Rhetoric.
rhetoric. Undoubtedly, but that's the very question. How should we think about the relation between race and class? The distinctive feature of the integrationist orthodoxy is that it separates race from class and treats race as a threshold issue that must be addressed first, separately from class, as opposed to what we described as the Reconstructionist approach in the aftermath of the Civil War. So it's not as if either of those approaches is denying your point that there is this connection. But the question is, how should we think about the connection? And what should we do about it? Yes?
I guess I think it's important also to
Exactly. Yeah, but the alternative that I signaled does that in a different way. That is, it says attack racial discrimination. Make it a crime, as it is in many countries in the world. So it takes your point, but it's a different interpretation of what the evil is and what to do about it. It's strange that given how central this problem is for the United States, there should be so little discussion of these fundamental alternatives. The integrationist orthodoxy seems to be so dominant that attacks on it are, in a sense, anathema.
But I think, though, that your first two arguments, I think, are persuasive. The third argument that our dear sister is accenting here, which has to do with how do we proceed in such a way that we don't unsettle white fears, insecurities, and anxieties. You see, I don't.
But I don't see that as an issue of consciousness. I see it as an issue of.
Well, that's a matter of just
of material. You saw it as a problem of rhetoric, of discourse, but
But it's a seduction that renders you captive. I mean, Andrew Johnson argued in 1865. The reason why he vetoed the Reconstruction bills, because he didn't want to give these black people preferential treatment. And that's the same language we heard in the 1960s. Now you enslave them for 244 years, and you say, okay, they said, no, we got that's. So you say, no, we're talking about fairness. I give you an example of the Obama administration, why they upset me so much. The first 2 weeks, we were working with juvenile delinquents in New Jersey. They had to reauthorize the bill. Not even ask for any money, just reauthorize the darn bill. And they wouldn't do it immediately. How come? Because Fox News is going to tar and feather us. I said, I don't give a goddamn about Fox News. They're going to lie on you anyway. Do you believe it's right? Do you believe it's just? If you believe it's right and just and you don't proceed, I'm going to talk about it on television, which I proceeded to do. So the question is, we want something right, we want something just, and then you got to go with the flow. If other people get upset, they get insecure, they get fearful, c'est la vie. When you are fighting for something just, you're going to upset a whole lot of people. You know what, though? We're turning away from these precious folk on the left here. I'm not used to ignoring my left. but you see the point I'm making? So that in that sense, Roberto makes these strong arguments for those first two, but when it comes to the white working class, which is not homogeneous, you got some of them highly progressive, others not too progressive. And as we pointed out in Brother Charles Murray's text, they're coming apart.
It's not, just to emphasize the point.
Yes.
With respect to the white working class, it's not just a matter of some kind of moral offense to them. They believe themselves to be dispossessed by the dominant policies in the country. And to my mind, they are. They're right. They are dispossessed. Yes. Yes.
Both of those two things are problematic. But to say that I think that it's important to recognize that affirmative action is important for remedying the attacks on African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinx Americans in higher education.
That's right.
And is a remedy rather than reparation.
Well, yes, but so what should be, so more particularly, the debate is what should be the criterion for the deployment of the remedy? Should it be race alone, or should it be the objective situation of what I call entrapment, of some form of subjugation, of which race is just one dimension, together with others, but a fundamental basis is the character of the class structure. So,
but at the level of consciousness,
yes.
if the dominant tendency is to scapegoat the most vulnerable rather than
Yes.
confront the most powerful.
Yes.
Then the dispossession, which is real among white working class men and women, brothers and sisters. But if they are then scapegoating the immigrants, scapegoating black folks, scapegoating others, rather than the source of the structural source of dispossession, which is not black or brown or red middle class peoples.
So it is a characteristic phenomenon in all of these contemporary societies in different ways.
That's right.
That when there is no structural response to the problems and sufferings of the working class majority, then a series of forms of what you call scapegoating proliferate.
The authoritarian populism
within the working class majority.
Right.
And then the question is, what's the role of a policy such as the integrationist orthodoxy in the perpetuation of that phenomenon? And what are the alternatives to it? That's the question.
Mm-hmm. You want to jump right in?
Yeah. But we have to kind
Yeah,
of...
one more question. Mm-hmm. Very good question. Very good question. I mean, given the realities in place, you got to talk about Marshall Plans. You have to talk about massive investment for jobs with a living wage, quality education across the board, mass de-incarceration, especially for the nonviolent offenders, and making sure they have transition programs and so forth. So you really are talking about...
So that's the question about the structural alternative.
That's right. That we will be talking about.
It's not a question narrowly addressed to this. It's a question about the whole situation of the country. So the point is that any of these apparent debates, the debates that occupy the surface, the center of attention, lead into the absent debate, which is the debate about the alternative structure, as your remark just suggested. What then is the alternative? Well, that's precisely the question to which the American progressives, for the moment, have no answer.
Well, there's some isolated voices.
Yeah, and that's
but you got to demilitarize the federal budget, too. That 53 cents that we talked about before, going to military before you even move. You only got 46 cents to deal with for every dollar, you see. But you're talking about massive structural transformation, somehow linked to social movements. By William Barber and the others is so very important in terms of what they're doing with the Poor People's Campaign, to raise these kind of issues. White working class people do have the capacity to pursue justice. Now, Garvey's claim was, not enough of them do. Let's get the hell out of here. And he had enough evidence, lynchings and so forth and so on. But if you proceed, make that Pascalian wager on the capacity of human beings to pursue justice, then through education, exposure, struggles in context together, you can create multiracial, solidaristic movements that call for the kind of fundamental transformations as it relates to class and gender and empire and so forth and so on. Should we?
Yes,
stop?
yes, absolutely.
Okay, absolutely. We got. I don't think we can get it in there.
Well, I want to take that last remark as the prompt for what I propose to say. The central theme of this course is the interpretation of the American experience in the light of the alternative futures of American democracy. So in this course, we interrogate the American present and the American past by the light of a vision of transformative opportunity for the country. And there is a deep intellectual basis for this procedure. The basis is that always in the development of our insight, there is an inseparable connection between the understanding of what exists and the imagination of what can exist at the next moment, the adjacent possible. To understand a phenomenon is to understand what it can become. And a fundamental problem in the dominant practice of social science and historical learning is that this link between insight into the actual and imagination of the adjacent possible has been broken. That's why in an effort like this one, we can't just rely on the established forms of social science and historical study. Now, in our syllabus, generally, the early weeks are devoted to the interpretation of the present and of the past, and then the final part of the course to the programmatic alternatives. But because of this connection between insight into the actual and imagination of the adjacent possible, it seems that we must anticipate some element of this discussion of the alternatives. All of our conversation about the situation of the United States and the genealogy of that situation is informed by the assumption that there are alternatives. So it seems important very early in the argument of the course to suggest, at least schematically, a view of what such an alternative would look like. And that's why we have to depart from the linear sequence laid out in the syllabus. I then will proceed in 3 steps. In the first step, I want to make just some preliminary remarks about the attributes of such an alternative, the work that it must do. Then I want to focus on 4 main axes of transformation, especially institutional transformation. That's the heart of what I have to say. And then I want to end and suggest in the third and final part of my remarks 3 ways of thinking about an alternative like this one that I'm about to outline. So the first attribute of such an alternative is that it must serve as the possible project of a transracial progressive majority in the country. Every project in politics or political economy can and ultimately must be represented in 2 parallel discourses. A discourse about the institutional or structural changes, and a discourse about the alliances that form the constituency. And the right way to think about these 2 discourses is that they're just the reverse side of each other. It's not as if they were separate. Every project of an alternative has to be formulated in these two languages at the same time. So for the project to be the program of a potential transracial progressive majority, it has to avoid commitments that inhibit the formation of such a majority. And here are 3 examples that we've already touched on at different moments in our discussion. One example is a way of dealing with race that separates race from class in the policies of collective advancement, as in what I call the integrationist orthodoxy. A second example is taking a dogmatic stand in the contest of moral agendas in the country. So there's a contest in the United States between what is sometimes described as the traditionalist or religious moral agenda and the modernist or secular moral agenda. And the first agenda is commonly defended in the name of Christianity. But in truth, both of these agendas could be criticized as being primitive in their moral and spiritual content. And the first, as well as the second, deserving of criticism by the light of the Christian faith. Espousing one of these agendas against the other and attempting to enforce it by federal power is an enormous inhibition to the formation of a transracial progressive majority. A third example has to do with policies that are addressed to the alleviation of poverty. A characteristic of the New Deal, of Roosevelt's New Deal, which we're going to discuss next week, is that, like European social democracy, it always insisted on universalistic entitlements, as in the Social Security program. Entitlements addressed to the broad working majority of the country, and then sought to lift up the poor as part of that majority. Now, by contrast, the strategy of the alleviation of poverty that was embraced from the time of the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, who regarded himself as a disciple of Roosevelt,
Absolutely.
was to design policies that targeted narrowly the poor, breaking this universalistic social compact that was a central part of the Rooseveltian formula. And that fateful inflection could also be regarded as an inhibition to the formation of the transracial progressive majority. Now comes a second characteristic of the alternative, a fundamental characteristic. The alternative must not simply seek to humanize the established economic regime, to attenuate its inequalities, its inequities, its exclusions. It must represent the cause of constructive energy, of innovation. And it must offer the majority of people a share in this bigness, in this empowerment. That's always the commanding position in politics. The humanizers are always on the defensive. It's the ones who represent the cause of constructive energy who command the agenda. So the progressive can't be simply the humanizer of the program of the conservative. The progressives must have a vision of socially inclusive economic growth and empowerment. And that vision must go further than Roosevelt's vision, the vision of the early New Deal. The early New Deal, despite Roosevelt's genuine experimentalism, ended up narrowing its focus to the restabilization of the economy, what we would today call corporatism, the orchestration of competition, and then in its second phase, to the provision of antidotes to economic insecurity, such as Social Security. What it did not offer was a broader project of the democratization of economic opportunities and capabilities, of broad-based economic empowerment. And that is what would be necessary now. Now comes then the third characteristic that such a progressive alternative must have. Insofar as it is concerned with inequality and the overcoming of entrenched and extreme inequality, It must give priority to the change of the institutional arrangements that shape the original or fundamental distribution of economic advantage. By contrast to what you could call the secondary distribution, the focus of contemporary progressives and social democrats is compensatory tax and transfer by progressive taxation and redistributive social entitlements. So they take for granted or leave unchallenged the institutions and practices that determine the original distribution of economic advantage, and then attempt to correct it after the fact through this retrospective compensation by tax and transfer. But we know from historical experience that corrective redistribution is always only marginal or complementary in its effect. For it to have a massive effect, it would have to escalate to such a level that it would begin to derange the established economy. The incentives to work and save and employ. And so it can only be accessory to a more fundamental project. And this limitation is expressed in the conventional vocabulary of a tension between efficiency and equity. That's how we think when we come to take the established economic arrangements for granted. Now, the fourth characteristic of such an alternative is that insofar as it focuses on the reorganization of the economic regime, it cannot address simply the demand side or the consumption side of the economy. It must as well address the supply side or the production side of the economy. So the whole temper of this diminished contemporary progressivism is to work only on the demand side and to abandon the supply side to the conservatives. There is a fundamental asymmetry between addressing the demand side and addressing the supply side. Problems on the demand side of the economy can in principle be resolved by the reallocation of money, of capital. But problems on the supply side of the economy can only be addressed by structural innovation, by change in the institutional arrangements of the economy. Now, in the light of these preliminary remarks about what an alternative needs to look like to do this work, I then go to the heart of my discussion, which is a very bare bones outline of one such progressive alternative. Because I want to give you an example of an alternative that is detailed enough to stand as a proxy of this, for this idea of the missing structural conception, what the progressives now lack. Let me begin with education. So the whole objective is the enhancement of agency, of the power of the ordinary man and woman to act and to turn the tables against his circumstance. And so the first line of transformation is the transformation of education, with respect to both its institutional setting and its content, its nature. In any country that is very large, very unequal, and federal in structure, such as the United States, the threshold requirement for democratic education is to reconcile the local management of the schools with national standards of investment and quality. So the general principle has to be that the quality of the education that a young person receives must not depend on the happenstance of where he is born. To reconcile national standards with local management, we need three instruments. So the first instrument is assessment, national assessment of performance, of results, to discover what works and how it works. The second instrument is a redistributive mechanism to redistribute resources and even staff from richer places to poorer places. And that, of course, is incompatible with the complete dependence of the schools on local finance. And it requires a reformation of American federalism. And the third instrument is some corrective procedure to apply when, despite all efforts of support, a local school system repeatedly fails and falls beneath the minimum acceptable threshold of quality. Then it must be possible for the different levels of the federal system to join together in procedures of intervention and correction, to take over a local failing school system, to assign it to independent administrators to fix it and to return it fixed. Now comes the question of the content of such an education, the method of teaching and learning. So it must have the following characteristics to serve as a basis of economic and civic empowerment and of the dissemination of what I'm next going to describe as the most advanced form of production. First, it must give priority to the mastery of analytic and synthetic capabilities, rather than to the passive reception of information. Now, information is not, capabilities are not acquired in a vacuum of content. They are acquired in dealing with content, but what matters with respect to content is not encyclopedic coverage, but selective depth. So the education must be thematic and deep and selective. Third, in its social setting, it must accord primacy to cooperation among students, among teachers, among schools, as advanced science does, rather than to the combination of individualism and authoritarianism. And fourth, and most significantly, it must be dialectical in its approach. Every subject matter must be taught at least twice from contrasting points of view. This is the only way to liberate the mind. And to resist from the outset the orthodoxies of the university culture as they are projected backward to basic education. Now, the same conception of education applies to technical or vocational training as well as to general education. What it means in vocational training is that we privilege the higher order generic or flexible capabilities that are required by advanced production and contemporary technologies, rather than job-specific and machine-specific skills. Now, this is a great project, a project of national emancipation in the United States, and a fundamental requirement for creating a nation of individuals who can stand on their own feet and who can then act. Now comes the second axis of transformation. That has to do with the reorganization of the economic order. And the premise analytically is the following. We think given this contemporary anti-institutional orthodoxy, that there are only two things that we can do with a market order. We can regulate it, or we can attenuate after the fact its inequalities through retrospective tax and transfer. But actually, there's a third, more important thing that we can do with a market order, which is that we can reinvent it. We can change it in its legal and institutional content, as the Americans did in the early 19th century in the reorganization of agriculture and of finance. Now, there is a prompt, there is a provocation for such an exercise in the contemporary United States, which is the fate of the most advanced form of production. The United States is the most important seat in the world of the so-called knowledge economy. The economy dense in knowledge, not just associated with high technology industry, but present in every sector of the economy as a fringe, in precision or scientific agriculture or in intellectually intensive services. And the vast majority of the workers and of the firms remain excluded from these insular vanguards. That is the fundamental cause, not just of economic inequality, but also of economic stagnation, of slowdown of the rise in productivity. How could it be different if the most productive economic practice is restricted to fringes of the economy? So, a fundamental way to advance in the program of economic empowerment and of the democratization of the market economy is to disseminate this advanced practice of production throughout the economy. Now, how can that be done? This will be the subject of discussion as we go forward in the course, but I simply want to anticipate the view that it must be done in steps or in stages. So you can imagine an early stage in which the priority is to expand access, not just to capital or credit for production, but also to technology and to advanced practice and knowledge to a much broader range of firms and of parts of the labor force. Not from some central direction of the national government, but through a vast set of intermediate bodies, public-private bodies, with the participation of all different levels of the federal system. Then you can imagine a second stage in which, out of these attempts at democratizing access, there begins to develop an alternative institutional architecture of the market economy. On the vertical axis, in the relation between governments, local as well as national, and firms, forms of decentralized strategic coordination or partnership in the service of the dissemination of the most advanced practice of production. And in the relation among these firms, regimes that we call cooperative competition. They compete against one another, as the family farmers did in the early 19th century, but at the same time they share or pool certain resources, achieving economies of scale. And then at a third stage, further ahead, the creation over time of alternative regimes of property and contract, alternative ways of decentralizing access to productive resources and opportunities that begin to coexist experimentally in the same market order. The market economy should not be fastened to a single version of itself. And the ultimate objective is this objective of economic empowerment, which is achieved through the intermediate goal of the economy-wide dissemination of the most advanced practice of production. Now I come to the third axis of such a program. The third axis has to do with the fiscal and financial basis of such an alternative. Its basis in both public finance and private finance. So, with respect to public finance, the fundamental requirement is to sustain a high tax take. Now, here's a problem that the progressives generally don't understand, and in particular the American progressives. They habitually genuflect to progressive taxation as a placeholder, a surrogate for the structural program that they don't have. We know that progressive taxation has only a marginal effect on economic inequality. On paper, among the rich industrial democracies of the North Atlantic world, the United States is the country that has the most progressive tax system, because it is the tax system that relies most heavily on the progressive taxation of personal income. By contrast, the European social democracies rely more heavily on the indirect and avowedly regressive taxation of consumption. How are we to explain this apparent paradox? The fundamental explanation is that the European social democracies take in a much larger amount of public revenue. Their tax take is at least 10% higher of GDP. And they take that higher amount because they rely on the most neutral tax, the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax, or some functional equivalent to it, which maximizes the tax take but minimizes the economic trauma, because it is neutral with respect to the established system of relative prices. So everything that's lost by way of progressivity on the revenue-raising side is gained in double on the spending side. What matters in the short term is not how progressive the tax system is on its revenue-raising side, but simply what the aggregate level of the tax take is and how it is spent. Then later, in a second historical moment, you can make it explicitly progressive through, for example, an individualized and steeply progressive tax on individual consumption, on the hierarchy of standards of living. Now, what is the use of this higher tax take? You can imagine a spectrum. At the beginning of the spectrum, the use is investment. Investment in people and in their capabilities, the greatest historical achievement of European social democracy, as well as in the physical infrastructure of the country. But later, in the development of this spectrum, in these projects of dissemination of the most advanced practice of production, not as subsidies, as out-of-pocket subsidies, but as investments that result in equity stakes that might be initially held by the government, but that the government would then transfer to the citizens. The citizens would have equity stakes in the productive assets of the country. In this kind of national venture capital, conducted in a radically decentralized and competitive form. And what about private finance? Consider these three enigmas with respect to finance. The first enigma is that under the current arrangements, in all the rich North Atlantic economies, the production system is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. What's the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets? has an indirect and oblique relation to the funding of the productive agenda of society. The second enigma is that under these arrangements, private finance is largely indifferent to the real economy in good times and destructive in bad times. And the third enigma is that what in principle should be one of the main goals of finance, which is the funding of the creation of new assets in new ways, is in fact an entirely minuscule and peripheral activity in the capital markets. Venture capital, for example, accounts for a tiny proportion of total financial activity. So what we would want then would be a series of reforms designed to tighten the link between finance and the real economy, so that finance, instead of being a bad master, becomes a good servant. Arrangements that discourage or prohibit forms of financial activity that have no plausible relation to the expansion of output or the increase of productivity, and policies or arrangements that mobilize some of the dormant productive potential of finance for this undone work of venture capital, of investment in the production of new assets in new ways. Now then, the fourth axis of the transformation, and that has to do with politics, with the organization of the democratic state and of democratic politics. The progressive must want a high-energy democracy, a democracy that doesn't need crisis to make change possible. Crisis typically in the form of economic ruin or of war. And a democracy that therefore overthrows the rule of the living by the dead. There are three sets of crucial institutional innovations that go in this direction. First, innovations that raise the temperature of politics, that is to say, the level of organized popular engagement in political life, through the public financing of political activity, through the gratuitous access to the means of mass communication, through the electoral regimes, and so forth. The second set of innovations are innovations in the constitutional arrangements that are designed to accelerate the pace of politics, rather than to perpetuate impasse. For example, through comprehensive programmatic plebiscites and referenda, or through early elections that could be called by either of the two political branches of government, but that would always be bilateral, that is, for both branches, so that the branch that exercises the constitutional prerogative to break the impasse has to run the electoral risk itself. And then the third area of transformation is this, the reinvention of federalism. Federalism is supposed to be the organization of laboratories of experiment, as it is described in the canonical documents of American federalism. But the institutional and legal structure of conventional federalism, in fact, conspires to suppress this experimentalist potential of the federal regime by making it hard for different parts of the federal system to cooperate with one another, and by making it hard for any one state of the union or municipality to deviate from the general solutions. As society goes down a certain path, it should be able to hedge its bets by allowing parts of itself to deviate from the national path and to try out something else, to create counter models of the national future. So long as this deviation is not used to entrench some form of subjugation or exclusion, and therefore under control, under judicial control, as well as political control. Now, it seems clear to me that in the American context, the place that is easiest to begin, in which to begin, is the third place, the reinvention of American federalism. the American progressives are attached to, understandably, to the reform of the arrangements governing the relation between money and politics, but that doesn't seem to be, in fact, the most accessible point of departure for the creation of a high-energy democracy in the United States. Now, I've just outlined an example of a program because we're always referring to this notion of a structural alternative. But we have to have some idea of what a structural alternative might look like, and I've just given you an idea. Now, in the presentation of an alternative, we have to understand that any alternative worth thinking about can be represented at points relatively close to what exists or relatively far from what exists. So again, it's that rhetorical dilemma of programmatic argument. If I describe it at a point close to what exists, you say that's feasible, but it's trivial. If I describe it at a point far from what exists, you say that's interesting, but it's utopian. This is a misunderstanding of the nature of transformation. It's not about blueprints. It's about succession. It's not architecture, it's music. And in a programmatic argument, the two most important attributes are always, first, to define a direction, and second, in the particular historical circumstance, to select the most promising initial steps by which to begin to move in that direction. For the purposes of exposition, to explain the direction, it's useful characteristically to emphasize intermediate points that are neither very close nor very far away. They serve the purpose of clarification, and that's what I've just done in this exposition. But that's not what we can do in politics, because in actual political practice and persuasion, these intermediate points are too close to arouse enthusiasm, but too far away to seem realistic. And therefore, the discourse of political persuasion characteristically combines the very close steps with the very far away vision. It is both practical and prophetic, rather than focused on a scholastic clarification in the spirit of the argument that I've just outlined. Now I've come to the last step of my remarks, and simply to suggest to you three different ways of thinking about an alternative like this one in relation to the problems and texts that we discuss in this course. So one way of thinking about this kind of an alternative is that it represents an effort to reinvent what I described as the movement that helped form the United States in its early period, in its early independent life, before the Civil War in the first half of the 19th century. I said there was a Hamiltonian project at the top of the mobilization of national resources to build a country. And down below, there was, alongside the vast incubus of African slavery, a selective democratization of economic opportunities in particular sectors, in the two sectors that were crucial to a pre-industrial economy, agriculture and finance. In those two sectors, the Americans didn't regulate the market. They invented kinds of markets, agricultural and financial markets, that had never existed before. And that's what the country would have to do again in spades, in every department of its life, combining this mobilization from on top with this democratization sector by sector, now in the service of the dissemination of the most advanced practice of production. A second way to think about this project is by contrast to the previous moment of institutional refoundation in the United States, Roosevelt's New Deal. I said at the beginning, Roosevelt's New Deal, in its earliest stage of institutional experimentalism, despite all of the ambition of the president and of his advisors, ended up focusing on a corporatist restabilization of the economy, concerted action between the state and big private firms to manage competition rather than to radicalize it, and to restabilize an economy that was in turmoil. And then in its second stage, it narrowed its focus even more to the provision of antidotes to economic insecurity, such as Social Security. What was denied, what was rejected in this succession, was the more ambitious program of economic empowerment, of the democratization of economic opportunities and capabilities, and that is precisely what lies at the center of this alternative that I've just outlined. Now here's a third way to think about such an alternative. Now, in reference both to the contemporary progressives and to the classical progressive thinkers of the 19th century, the liberals and socialists of the 19th century. Now, the contemporary progressives and their philosophers, their political theorists, see the progressive position as a position that emphasizes equality, by contrast to the conservatives who prioritize freedom. But it's shallow equality and shallow freedom because it's equality or freedom against an unchallenged institutional background. So they seem to have a radical egalitarian faith. But they combine this egalitarian faith with an institutional skepticism or conservatism. What's the significance of this combination? The significance is revealed in the philosophies of justice that have been prominent in the Anglo-American world. They have this very abstract character of social contract, general theories of distribution. But what are they really? They are a kind of pseudo-philosophical prop, a pseudo-philosophical gloss on the homely practices of compensatory redistribution under institutionally conservative social democracy. There is nothing in them about structural change, about institutional reinvention. They enunciate principles that justify progressive taxation or redistributive social entitlements. So the goal is equality, but it's a kind of downsized equality. It's equality in the context of the unchallenged institutional framework. Now, contrast that to the liberals and socialists of the 19th century. Their goal was not equality. The goal of the leftists in the 19th century was not equality. The goal of the leftists and of the liberals in the 19th century was greatness, a shared greatness, a larger life for the ordinary man and woman. And the attack on equality was accessory to this larger effort. So it was not the humanization of society that was their objective, it was the divinization of humanity. The increase of our share in the qualities that we attribute to the divine, not the qualities of omniscience and omnipotence, but the quality of transcendence. This shared bigness, that was the goal. Now, the goal as they described it, Tocqueville, Mill, Herzen, was too narrowly formed on the model of the aristocratic example of self-possession. We have to have a broader idea of this democratic greatness. And the method of these liberals and socialists was always some structural alternative. Each of them had their institutional formula, the system, the classic system of liberal rights, the socialist control of the economy. And here's our problem. We understand the imperative of structural change, of structural imagination, but we are unable to convince ourselves that there is any definitive institutional formula. And therefore, we have an unprecedented problem, which is to cultivate the structural imagination without succumbing to a structural dogmatism. Part of the solution to that problem is to develop institutions that, among their attributes, have the attribute of facilitating their own correction in the light of experience, of being open to correction, of organizing their own transformation in the economy and in politics. That's the solution to the problem. But in this dispute between the 19th century liberals and socialists and the social democratic humanizers, it's obvious that an argument like the one I just made stands much closer to the side of the classical liberals and socialists, while wanting to reinvent both their method and their conception of the goal. Now, again, Tocqueville reminds us that when politics is serious, it is also always religious. Every great revolution is both a political revolution and a religious revolution, meaning that it is a change in consciousness as well as in institutions. And as I hope this programmatic argument makes clear, the ultimate question in a forum of political struggle that's serious is, who are we? And what can we become? What is the limit of our hopes? And this is now the spirit in which I propose we go forward in this discussion. Always seeing the present from the standpoint of an imagination of the future.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Two quick questions, Brother. You always provide such richness. How do you account for the relative decline of the discourse of greatness in the 19th century with the John Stuart Mill or de Tocqueville or Marx to the discourse on equality on the left or liberty and freedom on the right? How do you account for that decline? And the second question is, how do you resist being seduced by the discourses of equality and freedom, and you hold on to a discourse of magnanimity and greatness?
So going back to those categories of shallow freedom and shallow equality. So
in the 20th century.
In the 20th century.
Yes.
So this is the contemporary presentation of the ideological dispute. They're the ones who, there's freedom and equality, they're in tension with each other. Mm-hmm. Who's a leftist? The leftist is the one who thinks equality is more important. The rightist is the one who thinks that freedom is more important. Mm-hmm. What they share is leaving unchallenged this institutional background. Now, suppose we then relax this constraint of leaving the background unchallenged. Will we say that then the leftist is in favor of a deep equality? What would that mean? That would mean that the supreme objective is to ensure a close equality of outcome or of circumstance. So there's some economic dynamism, there's some process of exchange. We'll cancel it out. Let's give the example of a system of agrarian reform. You distribute the land and you say the land is inalienable. If there's a set of transactions that leads to economic concentration, you cancel them out. We want to be like Sparta in the sense of equality among the free citizens, or some mythical idea of ancient Rome. That was never, and should never have been and never was, the predominant position of the progressives. So what do they really want? Not deep equality, but deep freedom. That is, they wanted the ordinary person to be greater, to have a larger life with more capability, with more scope, with more intensity. And of course, this larger life was incompatible with an entrenched and extreme inequality. But the struggle against inequality was subsidiary to this larger goal. Now, their institutional methods were insufficient to advance this goal, right? And so there was this early revolutionary impulse, and then it wanes, it fails. And then we have, in the middle of the 20th century, what the Europeans describe as the social democratic compromise. The New Deal was the American counterpart to that. And how do we understand this compromise? The forces that challenged the organization of power and production renounce this challenge. They give it up. And in exchange for this renunciation, the state is allowed to acquire the power to regulate more intensively, to redistribute correctively, and to manage the economy countercyclically through fiscal and monetary policy. But now there's been a retreat from the attempt to reshape the structure of either the economy or the state. Now it turns out that none of the fundamental problems of the contemporary societies, such as the problem of the hierarchical division of the economy between advanced and backward sectors, or the problem of the relation of finance to the real economy, can be solved without innovation in the institutional arrangements. So then this social democratic compromise has to be attacked from the side of its method or practice. But that attack then provokes an attack on the vision of the goal as well. It's, this business about equality it's like a compensation price. You give up on the larger objective of becoming bigger, and then you say, at least it won't be savage. It's as if this relative equality were sufficient. Like Rousseau says in the Emile, they couldn't be men, so they decided to become rich. And it's as if this narrow idea of economic equality were the placeholder, were the substitute for the larger ambition. So I think that the social democratic compromise unravels on both sides, on the side of its method and on the side of its vision of the goal. We have one of the reasons why we have trouble understanding that is that for the left and for the progressives, the dominant intellectual influence has been Marxism. And the Marxist understanding of history is that there are these systems. There's a closed menu of alternative regimes, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. Each of them is an indivisible system. And there are laws of historical transformation governing their foreordained succession. So on that view, then, politics must always be one of two things. Either it's the revolutionary substitution of one system for another, or it's the reformist management of one of these systems. The revolutionary substitution is not in the cards. If it were in the cards, it would be too dangerous. So what's left? What's left is to humanize the world, to manage the established order. That's how they think. But all of those assumptions are false. There isn't this closed menu of regimes in history. The regimes are not indivisible systems, and there are not these laws of historical transformation. So then we have to begin to think about structural change in a completely different way.
But Marx was one of those 19th century thinkers you're talking about.
Yes.
Who had a conception of greatness that went far beyond just equality.
Yes,
he about a certain
absolutely right.
New species, absolutely a new quality of human beings.
Absolutely right. Marx is in that respect an example of what I said.
Exactly.
In both respects, that the ideal is an idea of the elevation of human life to a higher plane, and that the method is structural change. The problem is that his conception of structural change is entangled in a series of illusions, which are these deterministic or necessitarian illusions. that there are these systems, that they're indivisible, there are these laws. And now there's this paradoxical situation in which this idea of systemic revolution has become, in political experience, an alibi for its opposite. So what happens in the world is the ex-leftist, the disenchanted Marxists, many of whom now govern countries in the world, say, well, real revolution would be the substitution, capitalism by socialism or some other such abstraction. That's not possible. So let's cultivate our garden. Let's humanize the world. Let's manage this. So the rhetorical and psychological function of the idea of revolution in this circumstance is to serve as a pretext for its opposite. So it's not possible, it's too dangerous, but there's something else to do, which is this work of reformist humanization. So that's what we have to get away from in our political sensibility. And we have an intellectual difficulty because the established forms of thinking in social science and history do not provide us with the requisite intellectual instruments for thinking about structural discontinuity.
Questions? Yes.
Do you want to begin?
No, it's a wonderful question. I mean, just empirically, if the only American fellow citizens who could vote were between 18 and 30, Bernie Sanders would be in the White House rather than Donald Trump. Why? Because they have experienced catastrophe in Wall Street 2008 and 9. They've been deeply shaped by struggles against white supremacy and homophobia and patriarchy and so forth. So they do have a relative openness to keeping track of the humanity of others as opposed to their grandparents. What does that mean? That means also that the vast majority, not the vast, the slight majority of that same group prefers socialism over capitalism. Now what they mean by capitalism, open question, predatory as opposed to Sweden, as opposed to Norway. What do they mean by socialism? Hardly any idea at all. Just Bernie's a democratic socialist from Brooklyn who now lives in Vermont. But they know they're open to an alternative. So all of a sudden, the neoliberal commitment to there is no alternative is radically called into question. In the 1980s, when we were teaching during Reagan and Thatcher, the vast majority of young people had completely given up on the alternative. That was it. Very different moment now, even though the crisis is deeper ecologically with nuclear, so forth and so on. So that means then, you're absolutely right, we're at a moment in which things are melting in terms of the consciousness of young folk, even as things are becoming more icy with escalating neo-fascist sensibilities, policies, leadership in the White House, and so on. What a juxtaposition, but a crucial one, because that's what crisis is about, danger and opportunity.
So let me make two remarks. First on this impulse, on this vitality that you describe. There seems to be a striking disproportion between the animus, the spirit, which is open, which is searching, and its vehicle. Because for the most part, the programmatic expression of this vitality is primarily a commitment to redistributive entitlements. So it's like the late New Deal. It has almost no structural content. So that's this imbalance, because in the absence of a different vision, of a different set of political and economic ideas, they seize on what they can see. Like you mentioned Sanders. So to me, Sanders seems to be a kind of late New Dealer. Not just in the sense that he comes very far after the New Deal, but he expresses a late stage of the New Deal after its early institutional experimentalism, the narrow focus on entitlements and on antidotes to economic insecurity. This completely inadequate, as not just inadequate as a response to the problems of the country, but inadequate as an expression of the political spirit that you're describing. Entitlements are an important element of any alternative. Mm-hmm. But it's one thing to have entitlements as a fragment of a structural alternative, and it's another thing as to have entitlements as a substitute for the missing structural alternative. And that seems to be mainly what's happening. Now I just want to come to another aspect of your provocation. So what's crucial in changing this situation, what is always fundamental in change, is the combination of exemplary action with visionary teaching. So you can't change the world without ideas. And in a transformative practice or transformative vision, you have to have a conception of the alternative direction laid out as a sequence, not as a blueprint. And then if you're an agent in national life, in politics, you have to be able to provide, or at least to suggest, down payments on this future. So there has to be something tangible and fragmentary right now that you can see as a foreshadowing of this alternative direction. That's always the method of the prophet, the political prophet or the religious prophet, because we're all like Thomas and have to touch the wound to believe. We need some tangible anticipation of this alternative. But once that begins to happen, then everything changes.
I think Bernie had that with the free tuition. That was very concrete. Interest-free loans for Wall Street for 3.5 years coming out of the Fed, students paying interest on loans. That juxtaposition between his critique of Wall Street and something very concrete had something to do with the young people's excitement about what he was putting forward, based on something very close. But still, his larger vision, of course, was one of a late New Dealer. But given a decrepit political system dominated by big money, Bernie was left-wing in that decrepit political system, and therefore worthy of people getting excited about a possibility of something vis-a-vis a right-wing Republican and a milquetoast neoliberal in Hillary Clinton. So you got some alternative with energy, with enthusiasm, but still in the way inadequate. I know, should I look over here to a question, the dear sister right here? And speak up so we can all hear.
Louder.
Yes.
That there's
Jordy.
if we're working towards that, like what do you see as?
Well, I mean, well, take an example, which we're not going to have much time to talk about it now, but it's an example that can follow us through the course, because it's a very important example, which is the example of the fate of the declining mass production industries in the United States, sometimes called the Rust Belt. So it's the traditional mass production industry. One of the many points of commonality between the progressives and the conservatives in the United States is that they both seem to think that they should attempt to wring a few more years of life for mass production industry. Avoid plant closings, bring jobs home, keep the air conditioner factory in Indiana or whatever. It's a kind of hopeless enterprise. It has no future. They must know that it has no future. It's like playing for time. But the question is, what comes next? What is it a part of? So the project that would have a future would be the project that would attempt to convert this form of production into the next stage, what I'm calling the knowledge economy. Now that involves not just a set of policies or programmatic initiatives, but the formation of a new set of alliances with the small business class, with the underclass workers, and so forth. And then there's this asymmetry that you mentioned about historical time and biographical time, because the politician or the union leader can protest. You're asking me to risk my connection to my core historical constituency before I have another base, and now I'll be left with nothing. So he can say to himself, well, this has no future, but by the time that becomes manifest that it has no future, I'll be dead. And so one of the fundamental problems in political transformation is how we deal with this issue, which the economists call a principal agent problem. And we must deal with it, and we do deal with it. Otherwise, transformation would never happen in the world. So at some point, the defender of the alternative has to say, this project of simply defensively of surrounding the declining form of production with a moat has no future. We have to have a bolder project. Yes. Yes.
What is that movement today? I mean, if it's not, religion, what is it? Because people can individually embrace that program, but if we don't have the platform or the technology, or if we don't know what that is.
So by the platform, you mean what's the venue? What's the position in society? Well, isn't it everything? That is, it's politics, it's the union movement, it's the academy, it's the newspapers. So it's not as if there were one privileged platform, as you call it, right? So all of these venues now are enlisted in the service of these established ideas. So if the question is, where can you begin to disrupt the conversation and change its direction, it's anywhere or nowhere. But I don't see how you could have an argument that says there's somehow a privileged agent or a privileged forum in which you would do this. The same problem will arise all over. And clearly, one way of addressing the issue you describe is that the narrow discourse of professional politics is an insufficient basis or platform for this change of the conversation. So it has to happen in a larger national conversation that penetrates all the elite and specialized disciplines, and then that goes back and forth among these many levels. But
But there really is
Harder
no,
s- harder
there really
said
is
than
no
done.
answer to
Yes,
your question in
exactly.
terms
No
of
formula.
a transracial majority.
So confused that it never takes off. Like, does everything matter?
Well, I think it takes off. You just don't have substantial coming together. That's what it is. Because it's taken off all the time. Single issues here, single issues there, double issues. It doesn't coalesce. We don't have a coalescing taking place. Well, it's hard to say because history is unpredictable.
breakthrough.
Yeah.
Well, it starts with us just like taking accountability and accepting the fact that, for instance, with this election, a lot of it, as much as we want to blame Republicans, a lot of this, we let it happen. So it doesn't matter the venue. The first part is accountability. If we accept the fact that we need to make a change, the venue and the platform in itself will take care of the system. But the first part is accountability.
Well, that's certainly crucial, but the crucial question she's raising is who is the we? And when does the we become a majority? There's a whole host of progressive individuals and groups out there. But when you reach the point where you actually got a majority of progressives who are willing to pursue structural transformation, that is not that's relatively rare in the history of this nation. Let's be very honest about that. The abolitionists were thousands among millions in the country. The feminists were a few thousand among millions of men and women. So when we talk about progressives, you're cutting radically against the grain in a culture obsessed with newness, novelty, and innovation, but not when it comes with tinkering with the most basic institutions of the society. Now, we're going to come back to that. It's 3:03. But have a good week thinking about this.